Kafka is the author who comes nearest to bearing the same kind of relationship to our age as Dante, Shakespeare and Goethe bore to theirs. W. H. Auden. Franz Kafka, who Canetti famously called the expert of power, continuously shows us the worst sides of humanity in his writings: indifference, cruelty, isolation, and systems of power that individuals get caught up in. The story I want to talk about today is no different. It has arguably one of the most famous first sentences in all of German literature, which is, quote, Als Gregor Samsa eines Morgens aus unruhigen Träumen erwachte, fand sich in seinem Bett zu einem ungeheuren Ungeziefer verwandelt. Or, in the translation, as Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in bed into a gigantic insect. The Metamorphosis, written in 1912 and published in 1915, is a story of no more than 60 or so pages, but whose meaning still has all of its readers and critics arguing to this day. I personally had to read this story in school, as I think most teenagers in German-speaking countries have to, and I can say that I didn't really get it back then. I mostly just found it funny. It was, however, so absurd that it just stuck in my head, and a few times a year I would randomly think about it and the strangeness of it and wondered what it was that it meant, or what it was that Kafka wanted to tell us with it. Hannah Arendt wrote about Kafka. Kafka engaged in no technical experiments whatsoever. Without in any way changing the German language, he stripped it of its involved constructions until it became clear and simple, like everyday speech purified of slang and negligence. The common experience of Kafka's readers is one of general and vague fascination. Even in stories they fail to understand, a precise recollection of strange and seemingly absurd images and descriptions, until one day the hidden meaning reveals itself to them with the sudden evidence of a truth simple and incontestable. So that revelation of hidden meaning is what I want to share with you today, packaged into 5 tips that I would give to anyone who is looking into reading this novella. Because Kafka's writing is extremely clear and direct, but what he doesn't give us is a clear moral message. So we can find ourselves a little rudderless navigating his stories, because so much is implied and so little is explained. So in this video, I hope I can give you a little bit of direction on how to navigate and illuminate this work that Kafka has written by hand. Here's a photo of the first page, and we'll talk about Kafka himself, the famous first sentence, the transformation and metamorphoses that are going on in the book, the many ways of interpreting what's going on in the story, like the problem of communication or the deep criticism of capitalist society. I'll read you, as always, passages from the original German that I have here with me and of the English translation that I picked out by Willa and Edwin Muir. This is a collection of his short stories, and I found this great, firstly because it's a good translation. I've compared 5 or 6 or so and ended up with this one. And the second reason why it's a great addition is because this is a collection of all the stories that Kafka allowed to be published in his lifetime. Kafka himself said that, quote, "Of all my writings, the only books that can stand are these." and it's just great to have them all collected with great translations. So I can really recommend getting this and digging into the short stories of Kafka. Some of them are really short as a page. So yeah, that's it. If you're new to the channel, I'm Maria. I'm a student of comparative literature. If you're interested in my work, please do check out my literature courses. They're always linked in the description box below. And if you want to support the channel financially, I'll also link my Ko-fi account in the description box. Okay, let's get into it now. Franz Kafka was born in 1883 in Prague, which at that time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He grew up in a Jewish family and spoke German at home. His father, Hermann Kafka, was a successful businessman and expected his son to follow a similar path. And Kafka did what his father wanted. He studied and ended up working in an insurance company. He hated that, however. Here's what he wrote about his work at the insurance company. "My position is unbearable to me because it contradicts my only calling, literature." And famously he also said, "I have no literary interests. I am literature." So writing was everything to him. He called himself a blood relative to Dostoevsky, but he was also very critical of his own writing. It's estimated, in fact, that he burned about 90% of everything he ever wrote. Here's an example of how low he estimated his own writing. This is a diary entry from November 18th, 1913. Quote, "I will write again. But how many doubts have I meanwhile had about my writing? At bottom, I am incapable, ignorant person who, if he had not been compelled, without any effort on his own part, and scarcely aware of the compulsion, to go to school, would be fit only to crouch in a kennel, to leap out when food is offered him, and to leap back when he has swallowed it." Before he died, he asked his friend Max Brod to destroy everything that remained of his writings, but fortunately for us, Brod didn't do that. Kafka suffered from tuberculosis and died in 1924 at the young age of 41 years. He once described his illness in a very interesting and lucid way, which is quite remarkable for a time where the notion of a psychosomatic illness hasn't really existed yet. He wrote, quote, "Sometimes it seems to me that brain and lungs reached an agreement without my knowledge. This cannot go on, said the brain, and after 5 years, the lungs agreed to help." So, what now actually happens in the Metamorphosis? Our protagonist, Gregor Samsa, wakes up transformed into some kind of monstrous creature, an insect, a bug, we're not sure. And we never learn why. And Gregor never learns why. We learn pretty quickly that Gregor is a traveling salesman who supports his entire family, his parents and his sister. So even after waking up as an animal, without any explanation, the first thing he worries about is work. He thinks about the train that he might miss. And indeed, because he missed his train, his boss sends a chief clerk to check why Gregor hasn't come to work that day. Needless to say, those first few pages give us a strong and extremely strange opening. Of course, transformations into animals happen in literature, but they're usually explained. It's usually a story of, oh, that person was bad, so they got transformed into a spider. And usually those stories have 1, magic, and 2, an explanation. The Metamorphoses of Kafka have neither one of those. There's no magic in the story, and there is no explanation. Which leads me to my first point that I called "Don't get hung up on the bug." You'll see what I mean by that in a moment, but let's go back to the famous opening line. As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. In German, it says he is transformed, quote, zu einem ungeheuren Ungeziefer. So one reason why I picked the translation I picked is because it translated Ungeziefer into an insect, a gigantic insect. So it leaves the question of what he really turned into ambiguous. And that's good because the word Ungeziefer in German is ambiguous too. It can mean many things. It can mean vermin, pests. It's usually small animals that are meant, insects or spiders, but sometimes also mice. But it can also mean a despised creature. So when translations into English say he transformed into a giant bug or he transformed into a giant cockroach, it just doesn't hit the same way as the German Ungeziefer. Looking at the etymology of the word Ungeziefer, we can see that it originally meant an animal not suitable for sacrifice. The word goes back to Old High German ziehbar, meaning sacrificial animal. So Ungeziefer literally meant something impure or something unfit for sacrifice. Over time, it came to mean vermin or pest. But the key point I want to make here is that Kafka deliberately avoids naming a specific animal. And in fact, he also insisted that the creature should never be illustrated on the book cover. He was very vehement about no bug being depicted there. He didn't want these images being put into people's minds as they were reading it. And by doing that, I think he wanted there to be a wider room for interpretation and a wider room for identifying with that Ungeziefer. It's a really insulting word in German. Like if you call someone an Ungeziefer, you call them basically disgusting. In response to the question of whether Kafka maybe wrote about himself and identified with the Ungeziefer himself, the literary scholar Michael Minden wrote, quote, "The Ungeziefer of the story is Kafka the way Kafka is Kafka, or I am me, or you are you. In other words, we are all Ungeziefer. It just depends on the context, but we have most certainly felt disgusting, left out, or out of place. So the creature is not a bug necessarily, it's a metaphor for the condition of being human." My second tip is to pay attention to the transformation, not just of Gregor, but more importantly, the people around him. Metamorphosis is not a new idea in literature. Think of Ovid and his Metamorphoses. But as I already indicated, Kafka does something unusual by not giving us an explanation. Gregor himself wonders at some point how a thing like that can suddenly strike one down. So our Gregor is taken aback, but he never truly questions the absurdity itself. Instead, he keeps thinking about his work. Kafka really shows us here how our identity can become so tied up with the work that we do that we cannot imagine ourselves outside of it. And Gregor goes through stages of wrangling with his new identity. The story is split into 3 parts, and in the first part he deals with his relationship to his work. in the second part with the relationship to his family, and in the third and final part with his relationship to himself. There are also 3 attempts that he takes at exiting his room 3 times, and he gets chased back inside every time again. But even more interestingly to observe, in my opinion, are the transformations of his family members. Egon Schwarz, in the afterword to this Reclam edition, said that, quote, "The narrative apparently belongs to that ancient type of poetry where the intrusion of something strange and incongruent suddenly casts a completely ordinary, even banal environment in a new light, revealing its true nature. Gaining profound insights from the lackluster life of a traveling salesman and his family will not be easily achieved using conventional methods." So both of his parents and his sister go through quite intense transformations in this short story. His father, who starts out being ill, who's not working and who's kind of weak, turns into the dominant provider and decision maker of the family. While in the first part, he's still taking care that Gregor makes his way back into the room safely, he later chases him back with a stick and throws apples at him. His mother, who is also ill and like a weak figure, she constantly faints, actually turns into a woman who's more independent and who starts work. And his sister, who is really Gregor's only confidant in the beginning, she helps Gregor, feeds him and cleans his room. She is the one who, in the end, says, "We have to get rid of it." Here's the quote from page 124. "My dear parents," said his sister, slapping her hand on the table by way of introduction, "things can't go on like this. Perhaps you don't realize that, but I do. I won't utter my brother's name in the presence of this creature. And so all I say is, we must try to get rid of it." Here's the same passage in German. "Liebe Eltern", sagte die Schwester und schlug zur Einleitung mit der Hand auf den Tisch. "So geht es nicht weiter. Wenn ihr das vielleicht nicht einseht, ich sehe es ein. Ich will vor diesem Untier nicht den Namen meines Bruders aussprechen und sage daher bloß, wir müssen versuchen, es loszuwerden." The family as a unit turns into a normal middle-class working family with middle-class ideals by going through this transformation. And Kafka, with the story, really shines a light on how fickle the human heart is. And I think that's something we can all relate to. We think we know someone or we know ourselves, and then exceptional circumstances come along and we see a side of that person or of ourselves changed into the complete opposite of what we thought they were. That's a really painful aspect of that book, especially with the sister. My next tip is to allow for different kinds of interpretation. I feel that the greatest thing about Kafka is that his writing is very direct and provocative without giving us a clear moral message. So we have a lot of room to assert our own interpretations, and it really speaks for the story that I could sit here for much longer than it takes for you to read that story and talk about ways of interpreting it, and I would still barely even scratch the surface. Here is Egon Schwarz again, who said about this work, "How is it," the question is asked, "that a literary work can continue to fascinate new generations of readers long after the author and his original audience have disappeared, along with those shared living conditions that enable unquestioned communication. So I'm sure you've heard a plethora of interpretations for this story. There is, first of all, the image of the merciless society that the story presents us with. Way in the beginning, when Gregor first tries to get up with his new constitution and it's very difficult for him to roll from his back to his feet, he says, quote, "It struck him how simple it would be if he could get help. 2 strong people, he thought of his father and the servant girl, would be ample sufficient. They would only have to thrust their arms after his covert's back, lever him out of bed, bend down with their burden, and then be patient enough to let him turn himself right over onto the floor, where it was to be hoped his legs would then find their proper function." So he's longing for help, for that feeling of human connection that he unfortunately doesn't really get. He says that when his sister feeds him, he feels, quote, "no disability." Others prefer a strong autobiographical reading of the story. They see the father complex acted out and read the story as a parallel to Kafka's letters to his father, in which he writes to his own father, quote, "Dearest Father, you asked me recently why I claim to be afraid of you. I did not know, as usual, how to answer, partly for the very reason that I am afraid of you, partly because an explanation of my fear would require more details than I could even begin to make coherent in speech. And if I now try to answer in writing, it will still be nowhere near complete, because even in writing, my fear and its consequences raise a barrier between us, and because the magnitude of material far exceeds my memory and my understanding." He further writes in the letters to his father, "If you summarize your judgment of me, it is clear that you do not actually reproach me with anything really indecent or malicious, with the exception perhaps of my latest marriage plans, but rather with coldness, alienation, ingratitude. And what is more, you reproach me as if it were my fault, as if I might have been able to arrange everything differently with one simple change of direction, while you are not in the slightest to blame, except perhaps for having been too good to me." I'll link both the German and the English version of Kafka's letters to his father below in the description box for you. Very much worth a read. Going on in the possibilities of interpreting this story, some ask, is Gregor's metamorphosis even real or is it symbolic? Does it maybe only take place in Gregor's imagination? Is it merely an internal process? Is it maybe a sign of depression or an illness? Anatole Broyat said that the complete stories of Kafka is an encyclopedia of our insecurities and our brave attempts to oppose them. Next, there is also a way of interpreting that is most intuitive to me, like this is the one I would have jumped to first, I think, and that is that the Metamorphosis is a story telling us about a society where worth is inevitably tied to utility, and where when you're unable to contribute, you must be gotten rid of, because we live in a society that values being young and being able to work and not questioning the system. And so this book is about the pain of not fitting into that. In fact, when the chief clerk knocks to inquire where Gregor is, the mother assures him that He must not be well, otherwise he would never miss a day of work. Here's the quote. "He's not well, sir, believe me. What else would make him miss a train? The boy thinks about nothing but his work. It makes me almost cross, the way he never goes out in the evenings. He's been here the last 8 days and has stayed at home every single evening." There's also the possibility of reading this story in a biblical way, because Gregor's father throws apples after him at some point. And some say they see in that the act of being cast out of the paradise of the family. Some read the story as an allegory to the positions of Jews in early 20th century society. I'm quoting again from the afterword by Egon Schwartz. "May the origin of these oppressive fantasies to be found in Kafka's Judaism, in the situation of a minority whose members are condemned to struggle for a right stubbornly denied them, and who are constantly accused of a crime they did not commit, who are repeatedly denied the humble place where they can satisfy their unassuming inclinations, and who, the worst of all humiliations, must inhale the poison emanating from their enemies and despise themselves." Some also believe that the main theme of this story is miscommunication. At some point, when Gregor tries to speak for the first time, the family comes to the conclusion that was no human voice. So the family cannot understand him anymore. But the irony is that Gregor still understands everything they say, and he would be perfectly capable of communicating in other ways with them. Another side of this is that the father explains the family's finances later in the story, and we realize, quite shockingly, that the family actually had money saved. So Gregor didn't have to work himself to exhaustion to support them, but no one ever told him that. And he also didn't ask. So the lines of communication in the family just seem to be completely closed. Now, as someone who has dealt a lot with Kafka over the past years, I think there's obviously no way of knowing how Kafka meant his story to be interpreted. And I think it's just best to keep all these interpretations simultaneously in mind and not to tighten our grip around a specific one. I mean, isn't what makes this story so great the fact that it applies to so much in life, to so many people all at once? So whenever I read anything by Kafka now, I'm just constantly jumping in between different levels of interpretation. Tip number 4 is to pay attention to the emotional composition of the story. So this story is incredibly funny. I laughed out loud several times while reading it, and Kafka famously laughed out loud as well when he was reading his stories to his friends. And that hilarity, that absurdity, allows us to have some distance from the story, right? It allows us to not get swamped in feelings of pity, for example. I just learned at university the other week the difference between cognitive and emotional empathy, and I think that really applies to this discussion here. So cognitive empathy is a thoughtful comprehension of the motives and actions of our fellow human beings. It's what Kant called the extended mode of thinking. What is currently more popular, though, is emotional empathy. And that is the feeling of putting oneself in another's shoes. Now, the writer Namvali Serpil said in an essay published in 2019 called The Banality of Empathy that the problem with emotional empathy is that it gives us the good feeling of being right, but beyond that, it doesn't provoke any action. So to bring it back to Kafka, I think the distance that is created by the fact that the story is so absurd allows us real reflection and real cognitive empathy and the space for us to act if we heed the call. So there is definitely a tension there that I want to make you aware of. And there's also a tension between Kafka's clean, sober technique, as Hermann Hesse described it, and the absurd, strange content of his stories. I'm quoting Egon Schwartz again. One of the most effective effects arises from the fact that the enigmatic and mysterious are conveyed in a deliberately stark and precisely economical language. The unfolding of a micrologic that forms simple syntactic islands amidst the surging chaos. It is not without reason that Kafka has been called a Jewish Kierkegaard. And that's because Kierkegaard said that absurdity is ultimately a good thing, and that the absurdness in religious stories, for example, point to their essential truth. One way to understand Kafka's comedic technique is to compare it to silent films. Remember, early cinema had no spoken language, so actors had to express emotions through exaggerated gestures and movement. The same thing happens in Kafka. Here's Egon Schwartz again. Just like early film, which in its silence had to express emotions through exaggerated gestures and movements, Kafka transformed psychological movements into kinetic equivalents. In other words, instead of describing feelings directly, Kafka shows them through physical actions. The characters slam doors, they collapse, they wave with sticks, and many scenes of the Metamorphosis have, as Schwartz says, in common that they could appear in a Charlie Chaplin film. And just like Chaplin's films, Kafka's scenes combine social criticism and grotesque physical comedy. My fifth and final tip I called "Let it stab you." So if we take a step back from the story, something interesting happens, namely a reversal of perspective. And here's what I mean by that. When we look at Kafka's writings, we see that reality itself is already abnormal, sick, and out of joint. And if that's the case, then a truly realistic depiction of that reality must itself appear distorted, ghostly, uncanny, even monstrous. So Kafka doesn't distort reality for the sake of fantasy, he distorts it in order to show what reality already is. So that's what makes Kafka able to bring across this message in a very clear yet super strange way. That, in a performance-oriented, competitive society like he lived in, and like the one we still live in today, the old, sick, or incapable worker easily becomes an insect and is treated as a parasite that should simply be disposed of. I mean, I think we can all agree that this ideal is still I think we can all agree that this ideal is still deeply ingrained in us today. There are countless ways in which society subtly shames people for not being productive every second of every day. And Kafka understood that feeling personally, right? His own father, the businessman, repeatedly accused him of writing useless scribbling, that's what he called it. But at the same time, as Gregor loses his place in the economic machine, he also gains a new form of perception. He has a sort of awakening concerning the actual circumstances of his life. And all of that really raises a question that is kind of perpetually looming in my mind. And that is, what are the foundations on which I build my sense of self? I mean, my identity, for example, is very tied up with my creative output. And the thought of that just being taken away one morning is scary. Like, it feels threatening. And yet, reality is so fragile, right? Why wouldn't it be suddenly taken away? Like our work, our hobbies, our families, our health, it can all be taken away so quickly. Because, I don't know, life is just so unpredictable. And the question is, what remains after that? I mean, that's what I really love about the Metamorphosis. I feel like reading the story again really holds my feet to the fire when it comes to these questions. In some way, Gregor's story also resembles what existentialist philosophers later called bad faith. The way people define themselves entirely through social roles rather than through authenticity. And Gregor also really reminded me of Boxer, the horse in George Orwell's Animal Farm, who just worked endlessly, and he was always looking forward to his retirement because he really wanted to learn how to read. And it's just so heartbreaking because he never gets the chance. Like, he just dies of exhaustion. And then I think his meat is sold for profit or something. It's so heartbreaking to read. All of these stories also connect really seamlessly with Hannah Arendt's idea of the banality of evil. She talks about how destructive systems can function through like ordinary everyday behavior. So those are my final thoughts and personal reflections. I'll end with this. I think you'll have the greatest reading experience if you let this book stab you. Let the story question the identities you attach yourself to. And let the story, as Kafka himself would say, be the axe for the frozen sea within you. So that is all that I have for you today. Check out my other Kafka video if you haven't already, about the Hunger Artist. And other than that, I hope I'll see you again very soon. Thank you for listening, and bye-bye.